Ruth, and the family settled into their new home. George's dad did the wedding, and Ruth's Sunday school class made all the preparations for the wedding. He graduated from Wayne State University with a bachelor's degree, bought a new Nash Rambler, and welcomed a new daughter into the family all in the same week. He made Ruth promise not to have the baby on August 13th because he was really looking forward to a golf match up in Canada. Well, he should have made Reba promise that too, because Reba decided to be born on August 13th, and he never did get to play that golf game. Ruth said she was always very proud of her husband. When George met with the pulpit committee in Hamilton, Ohio, in the early 1960s, Ruth said, "They didn't seem very impressed with us. And to tell you the truth, we weren't that impressed with them. But after a couple of months, they called on George, and George knew in his heart immediately this was where God was calling him, and he told the family to start packing. It was there in Hamilton that George had one of his most successful ministries. He began his ministry there in an old downtown church that quickly exploded with new life. And in 5 years, the church had launched an ambitious building project that became affectionately known as Mount Baptist. The pastor of that church, Dennis Metzger, is here today. Dennis and his wife Ruth were classmates of Dulcie's and mine at Judson College back in the late 60s. George knew that this was where God intended him to be, and on August 4th, 1965, the fifth and final child born to the family, George Bronson Scripture III, was born. George remembers his dad teaching him how to use and care for hand tools and small power tools. He taught him how to do home maintenance and small building projects. But George articulated something else about his father, something that every child of every pastor who grew up in the 50s and 60s experienced. If the doors of the church were open, the pastor was there. And if it was time for Sunday school or worship or youth group, you were there. No exceptions. George said that the only way he ever had a chance of getting out of church was if he threw up right before they were going out the door. And Dad would say, "Now don't you feel better? Get ready for Sunday school." In 1973, George completed his ministry in Hamilton and moved to California, where he served churches in Sacramento and Napa. He retired there and began a long series of interim ministries, the last of which was, of course, in Fort Wayne. All of George's children had the same experience that I and my siblings had with our father. The church came first. Even though in his later years he regretted not having spent more time with his children, it was one of the reasons that his ministries were so successful. And I would say, considering how all of his children and his grandchildren turned out, God was faithful to him in that regard as well. We can't wait to see what happens with the 21, 22, 23 great-grandchildren that he has. According to all the testimonies I've heard, George Scripture was a great preacher who carefully handled the Scriptures and always tried to make his walk match his talk. Mom Scripture said that he always trusted the Lord. He would say, "God is always taking care of us, and he always will." He was always very trusting with others, strong in his faith, and extremely forgiving. It made him an easy target for those who would abuse his friendship. But you know, when you forgive easily, even without being asked, it never leaves a scar on your soul. His motto always was, "Rejoice in all things." And that motto was an inspiration to everyone around him. Throughout his life, Dad loved and prayed for his 5 children, his 11 grandchildren, and his 21 great-grandchildren. His heart was always deeply touched with joy and sorrow as his children and grandchildren invited him to pray for their children as they went through the struggles that all children go through. And oh, how he prayed that every one of his descendants would come to know and love and serve the Lord. Nothing thrilled his soul more in his golden years than the laughter and chaos that surrounded Thanksgiving reunions at Ben and Karen's home in Warsaw. I know I speak for all of us when I express our gratitude to Ben for hosting these feasts of love and laughter. And before I close, I'd like to share just a few of the hundreds of stories of his family. In the early 80s, these are stories from the grandkids, by the way. In the early 1980s, Grandma and Grandpa Scripture took Dulcie, Ruthie, Dulcie, and Bronson, their 4 grandchildren at the time, on a Greyhound bus trip from Cincinnati to California. What were they thinking? When passing through the Rockies, Grandpa told his very impressionable 6-year-old grandson the story of a young Indian boy who had wandered off from his family one day and became lost. Word spread among all the Native American tribes, and they began posting signs that read, "Watch for Falling Rock." Bronson spent the rest of the trip watching for a young Indian boy every time he saw the sign along the way. And the thing is, he was pretty sure he saw a young Indian boy. Grandpa remembered, though, with dismay as Bronson told the woman sitting next to him that his dad was a lion tamer. Now, Bronson doesn't remember this, but funny thing, Dad remembered it pretty clearly. He was so good he didn't even use a chair. Most of you know he was, shall we say, frugal. Well, when the bus pulled into Reno, Nevada for a dinner break, he herded all 4 of his grandkids into a casino where they had a really good buffet at a really good price. And he warned them, don't look at any of those, shall we say, scantily clad women. Keep your eyes on me. And he proceeded to sit them in a booth with a picture of a scantily clad woman right above the booth. And then all through the meal, he lectured them on how they should never go into a place like this ever again unless he was with them. In a few minutes, you will hear a poem entitled "A Great and Mighty Man," written by one of those grandchildren. In his lifetime, George pastored 10 churches spread across the country from New York to Pennsylvania, from Arizona to Michigan, from Ohio to California. He made an attempt at retiring in 1995, but a man who has served Christ and his church his whole life cannot escape the fields that are white unto the harvest. So he continued his service in interim positions in Ohio, Michigan, Hawaii, Arizona, Florida, and most recently in Fort Wayne, where he was instrumental, despite his age, despite his cancer, in helping 2 churches merge to form a new, and we hope and pray, mightily effective church for Jesus Christ in Fort Wayne. During his interim in Fort Wayne, George was diagnosed with bone cancer, and he was told that he had anywhere from a few weeks to a few months to live. Determined to complete the work that God had called him to in Fort Wayne, he stayed on, and he and Pastor Louis became great friends. I doubt